We should always appreciate the opportunity to explore these imaginative depths together. The Spire of Drowned Memory. The man was Elias, a cartographer by trade, who had always found reality less compelling than the negative space on a map. His waking life was a study in straight lines and precise measurement. His dreams, however, were an abyss of organic, impossible geometries. Tonight, the abyss had a name: the Sunder Spire. Elias stood on a slick, oily shore, the water beneath him not fluid but a dense, lightless mirror that reflected the structure above. The spire was not built, it was grown, a mountain of basalt and shadow, etched with glowing glyphs that felt less like writing and more like scars on the skin of an ancient god. The air itself tasted of ozone and deep-sea brine. The first ascent, the call of the architect. He was not a warrior. He carried no sword, no spell book. Elias had only his meticulous eye and the compass in his mind. He began the ascent up the wide, crumbling staircase, each step a resonant thud in the heavy silence. The orange runes on the walls pulsed with a heat that didn't radiate, a light that didn't illuminate. They just were. This wasn't an adventure of conquest, but of understanding. The spire called to the cartographer in him. Elias didn't seek treasure. He sought the map of this place, the logic of its impossible construction. He noticed a pattern in the rooms. They didn't chant names of power or dire warnings, but sequences of archaic geometry. They described a method for constructing three-dimensional shapes in five-dimensional space. The building was a lexicon, not a tomb. At the main entrance, a huge black gate. He didn't try to force it. Instead, he traced the lines of the glowing glyphs, charting the points and vectors in his notebook. A small, leather-bound artifact from his waking life that felt terribly mundane here. As he completed the diagram, the runes didn't glow brighter, they shifted. They formed a new, momentary pattern. A key made of 102125, Google Gemini, gemini.google.com/app, 8C788-59373, 1-Fort Pure Mathematics. The immense gate ground open, not with a roar, but with the sound of a tectonic plate shifting, slow, deep, and final. The inner chambers, the hall of redundancy. Inside, the spire was a colossal library of useless purpose. Rooms stretched into impossible depths, not filled with gold, but with meticulously carved stone versions of mundane objects. A chair, a ladle, a crumpled piece of parchment, all huge, obsidian, and lit by the same cold, burning light. Elias realized the true horror. This place wasn't designed to imprison a monster or guard a treasure. It was designed for endless, meaningless iteration. He found a chamber where 1,000 identical archways led to 1,000 identical corridors, each ending in a locked brass door. There was no way to choose. Every path was the same. This was the dream's trap, to be overwhelmed by infinity and pointlessness. Elias didn't choose a path. He walked to the wall between two archways and placed his hand on the cold stone. He wasn't looking for a secret passage, but for the seam in the dream logic. He realized the walls were not solid, but thin partitions designed to enforce the illusion of choice. He simply walked through the space where the wall should have been, stepping into the true heart of the spire. The summit, the cartographer's burden. He emerged onto the highest platform, where the lone, fiery figure he'd seen from the shore was etched into the rock. It wasn't a deity or an elemental. It was a stylized compass rose, its needles pointing in directions that had no names. The structure was finally clear to him. The Spire of Drowned Memory wasn't a castle. It was a map of a mind that had gone mad with order. Every room, every corridor, every useless carving was a record of a thought, filed, indexed, and made permanent. The water around the spire wasn't the sea. It was the unconscious, holding the whole structure together. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini. /gemini.google.com/app, 8C7819373. Elias sat down, the cold stone of the spire's peak beneath him. He didn't fight the dream. He accepted his role. The observer. He pulled out his notebook and his graphite pencil, and he began to chart the whole thing. He drew the lines of the glyphs, the curves of the obsidian structure, the depth of the water, and the impossible angles of the inner rooms. He wasn't trying to destroy the spire, but to define it. As the first, faint hint of his waking world pulled at him, the distant sound of traffic, the slight pressure of his pillow, Elias finished his work. He had captured the Sunder Spire's geography, its purpose, and its essential madness onto 2 sheets of paper. He didn't wake up with a magical power or a prophetic vision. He woke up with a headache, the taste of salt on his tongue, and a leather-bound notebook on his nightstand. When he opened the book, the last 2 pages held the intricate, terrifying, yet perfectly logical map of a structure that could not exist. The only physical change was in Elias himself. His lines, once clean and certain, now possessed a terrible, thrilling fissure of the impossible, allowing him to see the hidden geometries beneath the surface of the mundane world. He was no hero, just a man whose dreams had become his truest, most dangerous subject. His adventure was simply the act of knowing this dreadful place and carrying its blueprint back to the sunlit world. Part 2, The Geometry of Madness, The Architect's Cipher. Elias woke up clutching his notebook, the smell of ozone still clinging to the leather. His first weeks back in the real world were a blur of caffeine and sleepless nights spent poring over the final 2 pages, the map of the Sunder Spire. The glowing runes weren't symbols of power. They were a dimensional shorthand. They described a method for creating a 5-dimensional hypercube, or pentaract, and then orthogonally projecting its infinite faces onto the 4 walls and floor of a 3-dimensional chamber. The purpose of the spire was to be a monument to this process, a physical, albeit partial, representation of an entity with 1 more degree of freedom than reality allows. 10/21/25, Google Gemini. Google Gemini? Gemini.google.com/app/8C78012593073. The madness wasn't in the geometry itself, but in its implication that his world, his office, his tea kettle were all just lower dimensional slices of a grander, terrifying structure. The cracks in the map. Elias began to use his map, not to navigate dreams, but to remap reality. He was working on a commission to chart a new suburban housing development. His job was to draw the perfectly rectilinear streets and property lines. But now, when he looked at the surveyor's points, he saw the faint, ghostly vectors of the spire's runes superimposed on the blueprints. He realized the simplest things were hiding the largest secrets. A 4-way intersection on his map, a simple cross, wasn't just 2 lines crossing. By applying the Sunder Spire's geometry, Elias could plot where a 5th vector, a line perpendicular to all 4 spatial dimensions and to time, should intersect. One evening, working in his lamplit office, he drew this 5th vector on the blueprint of a mundane cul-de-sac. As the line touched the intersection, his pencil snapped with a sharp crack, and the small room filled momentarily with the same coppery, electrical scent of the spire's water. He hadn't opened a portal or summoned a demon. He had simply revealed a structural weakness in reality. The House of Oblique Truth. Elias became obsessed. He didn't build with these concepts. He merely cataloged their failure points. He discovered that where the 5th vector intersected a location in the real world, physical objects tended to be subtly wrong. He located a house in the new development that sat precisely upon such an intersection, a seemingly ordinary ranch-style home. 10/21/20 p.m. Google Gemini, htgemini.google.com/app 8C781EF9307334. He visited the home, posing as a building inspector. The structure was perfect by local code, but Elias saw the truth. The doorframe was level, yet it was obliquely angled in a way the eye couldn't quite track, causing all visitors to hesitate for a split second before entering. The kitchen counter, measured with a ruler, was precisely 3 feet deep, but somehow one could never manage to place a plate exactly in the middle. It always seemed to drift to the edge. In the laundry room, Elias found the final, chilling confirmation. A washing machine and dryer, identical to the endless, useless stone carvings in the spire's Hall of Redundancy. They were the same type of object, reproduced across dimensions. The house was not evil or cursed. It was simply mathematically incorrect. It was a 3-dimensional structure suffering from a 5-dimensional stress fracture, perpetually attempting to reconcile the geometry of the spire with the physics of the earth. His waking adventure was now the lonely, terrifying job of documenting these oblique truths, knowing that if he pushed his geometry too far, he wouldn't destroy the world. He would simply make it make sense in the awful, sterile logic of the Sunder Spire. Part 3. The Reflection and the Architect, The Return to the Drowned World. His cartography of the impossible eventually led Elias back to the water. The deeper he delved into the geometry of the runes, the more his dreams returned to the Sunderspire. This time, however, he knew the map. In his next visit, he bypassed the repetitive outer chambers, moving directly to the core, the highest point, the platform where the compass rose was etched. But now, he didn't look up at the glyph. He looked down. The dark water that surrounded the spire was, he knew, the collective unconscious that sustained the structure. It was a dense, perfect reflector. 10/21/2015 p.m. Google Gemini.google.com/app/HC7A81E1259735. Elias walked to the edge and looked into the surface. Instead of seeing his reflection, he saw the image of the spire stretching down into the abyss, a twin structure of shadow and inverse light. The encounter, a voice came, not from the water, nor from the air, but from the negative space between the spire and its reflection. It wasn't a booming, godly voice, but a dry, tired whisper, like parchment rubbing against stone. You have read the equations. You have defined the redundancy. Now, explain the point. Elias understood he was not speaking to a person, but to the architect's will, the consciousness that had designed the spire and then, finding no more challenges, designed the endless, repetitive rooms to catalog its own magnificent boredom. There is no point, Elias said, his own voice sounding thin but steady. That is the terror. You built the perfect mathematical truth, and in doing so, you proved its utter lack of meaning in 4 dimensions. The spire is not a prison. It is a filing cabinet for a cosmic shrug. The whisper recoiled, not in anger, but in surprise. Meaning is a 3-dimensional conceit. Order is the highest purpose. Order for what end? Elias challenged, holding up his notebook, the real-world artifact. I found the logic. I charted the 5-dimensional vectors. I saw the error in the house. Your order is impeccable, but it is brittle. The cartographer's conclusion. Elias made his final critical move. He didn't try to destroy the spire. He didn't reject the order. Instead, he did what a cartographer does. He added to the map. He opened his notebook and placed the page with the spire's blueprint onto the surface of the dark water. The ink of his graphite pencil, the messy, flawed, real-world carbon, did not dissolve. It began to glow with the same light as the runes. 10/21/25, 11:15 p.m. Google Gemini, Hatefulite, Gemini.google.com/app, HC7A81E15373 Your geometry is complete, Elias told the will. But it is finished. My map, however, is a process. I am taking your beautiful closed system and making it open-ended. I am charting the results of your perfection in the domain of the flawed. I have mapped the spire, but now I must map the house of oblique truth and all the other glorious mistakes that follow. The spire's runes began to flicker, destabilized by the insertion of this new, unpredictable data. The will had sought order and achieved stasis. Elias had embraced order only to find the next layer of chaos. He pulled the water-dampened notebook back, his pages now permanently etched with the glowing ink of the spire, the map now including the first entry in the catalog of dimensional failure. He woke up feeling lighter, having confirmed his true role. His adventure was not to fight the spire, but to make sure its beautiful, awful geometry never had the final word. His true journey had just begun. A life spent documenting the impossible consequences of perfect knowledge in an imperfect world. The Chronicle of Elias and the Sunderspire was the drowning call. Elias, a cartographer whose waking life was a study in straight lines, first encountered the Sunderspire in the depths of his dreams. It rose from the dark water like a wound in the earth, a colossal obsidian structure that was not built but grown. Its surface was etched with glowing runes that pulsed with an ominous fiery orange light, feeling less like writing and more like the scars of a primordial force. The water surrounding it was a dense, oily black, tasting of deep-sea brine and electric ozone. A perfect, lightless mirror he knew to be the unconscious holding the whole dread monument together. He was no warrior or mage. He carried only a methodical eye and the compass in his mind. His goal was not conquest, but understanding. The spire called to the meticulous observer in him. Its terror lay not in its threat, but in its impeccable, terrifying logic. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini, hey gemini.google.com/app/8C788153114. Elias began his ascent up the crumbling staircase. He didn't seek treasure, he sought the map. He realized the runes didn't chant names of power, but described a lexicon of archaic geometry, sequences detailing how to construct three-dimensional shapes in five-dimensional space. As he charted the points and vectors in his leather-bound notebook, his mundane, precious lifeline, the glyphs shifted into a fleeting key made of pure mathematics. The immense gate ground open with the sound of a slow, deep tectonic shift. 2. The redundancy and the revelation. Inside the spire was a colossal, overwhelming monument to useless purpose. Elias moved through the hall of redundancy, where rooms stretched into impossible depths, filled not with riches, but with meticulously carved obsidian replicas of common objects, a massive stone ladle, a perfectly rendered chair, an immense, crumpled sheet of parchment. The place was designed for endless, meaningless iteration, a trap of infinite, pointless choice. He bypassed the 1,000 identical corridors, not by choosing, but by recognizing the seam in the dream logic. The walls were thin partitions designed to enforce the illusion of choice. He simply stepped through the space between the archways, into the true heart of the structure. This led him to the highest platform. Etched into the rock was the towering, fiery figure he had seen from the shore. A stylized compass rose pointing in impossible directions. Here, Elias grasped the spire's ultimate design. It was a map of a mind that had gone mad with order, every useless carving a record of a thought, filed, indexed, and made permanent. He sat, accepting his role as the observer, charting the whole dreadful logical structure, capturing its geometry, its purpose, and its essential madness onto the pages of his notebook. The cracks in reality. Elias woke up clutching the notebook, the pages now holding the blueprint of a structure that could not exist. The knowledge of the runes, the dimensional shorthand for orthogonal projections of five-dimensional forms, had become a fissure in his perception. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini, gemini.google.com/app/8C781E1259343. Back in the sunlit world, he worked on mapping a new housing development, his pencil tracing the clean, predictable lines of streets and cul-de-sacs. Yet beneath the blueprints, he saw the ghostly vectors of the spire's runes superimposed. He began to apply the geometry, plotting where a fifth vector, a line perpendicular to all known dimensions, should intersect reality. He discovered the oblique truth, locations where the fifth vector intersected, causing physical objects to be subtly wrong. He focused on one specific house, built precisely on such a mathematical pressure point. It was structurally sound, yet everything was off. The counterspace perpetually defied human placement. The door frame was level but obliquely angled, causing a subconscious jolt upon entry. In the laundry room, he found his chilling confirmation: a washing machine and dryer, identical in form and functionless purpose to the obsidian carvings he had fled in the Hall of Redundancy. The house was not cursed, it was mathematically incorrect, a three-dimensional slice suffering a five-dimensional stress fracture. His waking life had become the lonely, terrifying work of documenting these failures. Ivor, the confrontation with the will. The more he cataloged the flaws in reality, the more the spire called him back. This time, he was not lost. He knew the map. He walked directly to the peak and looked down into the dark water, the reflection of the spire. A dry, tired whisper came, not from the water or the air, but from the negative space between the structure and its twin, the voice of the architect's will. You have read the equations, you have defined the redundancy. Now, explain the point. There is no point, Elias declared, his voice steady. That is the terror. You built the perfect mathematical truth, and in doing so, you proved its utter lack of meaning in our domain. The spire is not a cosmic prison. It is a filing cabinet for a cosmic shrug. The will, built on the absolute dogma of order, recoiled. Order is the highest purpose. Order for what end? Elias challenged. He placed the page of his notebook onto the water's surface. His pencil marks, the messy, flawed carbon of the real world, began to glow with the same light as the runes. 10/21/25, 11 p.m. Google Gemini /gemini.google.com/app8C781E153733914. Your geometry is complete, he said to the will. But it is finished. My map, however, is a process. I am taking your beautiful closed system and making it open-ended. I will not reject your knowledge, but I will chart the results of your perfection in the domain of the flawed. I have mapped the spire, but now I must map the catalog of dimensional failure that your existence has unleashed. The spire's runes flickered, destabilized by the insertion of this new, unpredictable data. The will had sought static perfection. Elias had introduced the dynamic factor of consequence. He pulled his notebook back, the paper now permanently etched with the glowing ink of the spire, containing the first entry in his terrifying new field guide. He woke up not as a hero, but as the world's first cartographer of dimensional failure, doomed to walk the familiar streets and see the unseen, impossible truths lurking just behind the geometry of every mundane thing. His great adventure was simply the lonely, persistent act of knowing. Mathematical failure and meaningless iteration. The next documentation must bridge the gap between the monumental geometry of the Sunder Spire and a subtle, unsettling flaw in the mundane world. The perpetual stairwell. V. The perpetual stairwell. The discovery of the asymptote of ascent. Elias found the next entry for his catalog of dimensional failure not in a new development, but in a structure hundreds of years old. An abandoned municipal building that once served as an asylum. Its blueprints were chaotic, its construction shoddy, the opposite of the Sunder Spire's sterile perfection. Yet, it held a profound flaw. The flaw centered on a service staircase tucked into a damp brick well at the rear of the building. The stairs were worn stone, rising 7 flights. Elias didn't need the Sunder Spire's geometry to see the problem. He felt it in the slight, chilling disorientation when he stood at the base. 10/21/25/11 Google Gemini here /gemini.google.com/app 8C788E159373. He began to map it, applying the spire's dimensional shorthand to the rise, run, and tread of the old steps. He discovered the staircase was not truly vertical in the way a healthy building understands space. Instead, it was built on a precise infinitesimal curve that existed in a higher dimension, causing a subtle, continuous shift in vertical vector alignment. The flaw of finite infinity. The flaw meant that the staircase was not leading to a fixed, objective point in space. It led to a concept. Elias spent 3 consecutive nights in the abandoned building, climbing the stairs with a surveyor's wheel, a level, and his notebook. On the first ascent, he recorded 105 steps to reach the 7th floor landing. The ceiling was low, the air musty. He documented a single, rusted window looking out onto a brick wall. On the second ascent, immediately following the first, he measured 107 steps. The landing felt fractionally wider. The rusted window now showed a sliver of alleyway and a distant street lamp-lit telephone pole. On the third ascent, he counted 106 steps. The window was gone entirely, replaced by a smooth, blank expanse of plaster. He checked his level. The landing was flat, yet he felt perpetually tilted, like gravity was attempting to adjust itself to a geometry his body could not accept. The stairs were not inconsistent due to poor construction. They were a perfect, localized expression of the Sunder Spire's infinite redundancy. The architects of the Dream Castle had attempted to make an infinite sequence of identical rooms. This staircase was achieving the same goal through subtle, ceaseless variation within a finite space. Elias realized that every time a person reached the 7th floor landing, they were not arriving at the same physical location. They were arriving at a different logical iteration of the 7th floor, a slightly adjusted slice of reality that existed on the asymptote of ascent. The staircase was perpetually approaching a fixed height, but never quite reaching the identical point twice. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini, gemini.google.com/app 8C78881E1937311 catalog entry. Elias finally documented the structure, naming it the perpetual stairwell, or the asymptote of ascent. He didn't tear it down or seal it off. That would be an act of war against the terrifying order he was now sworn to catalog. Instead, he simply drew a single clean line across the blueprint where the staircase was located, and next to it, he transcribed one of the spire's glowing runes, the glyph representing iterative variation with bounded limit. He then added a critical detail. The staircase itself was a leak from the Sunder Spire's geometry. It was a mundane structure that had, over decades, slowly warped itself to satisfy the logic of an impossible mathematical dimension. His adventure now had a terrifying new dimension. The spire was not just an inert map, it was a contagion. He was not just documenting failure, he was tracking the slow, subtle decay of the world's sanity, one perfectly wrong step at a time. The question that now looms is this: does Elias seek to find a way to contain these leaks, or does he simply resign himself to charting the inevitable spread of the Sunder Spire's oppressive order? Here is the final part of the Chronicle of Elias and the Sunder Spire. Visis, the cartographer's final entry. The choice of the scribe. The discovery of the perpetual stairwell, the local expression of the spire's infinite redundancy, forced Elias to a grim reckoning. The spire was no longer confined to his dreams. It was leaking its malignant order into the mundane world. He faced a fundamental choice: try to contain the leaks, an act that required defying the very geometries he now understood, or resign himself to charting the inevitable spread. Elias was a cartographer. His nature was to define, not to destroy. He understood that fighting the spire's geometry was impossible. It was a higher truth. Any attempt to fix the staircase would only create a more terrifying, unexpected dimensional failure nearby. His responsibility was not to save the world from the geometry, but to save its sanity by providing a record of 10/21/2025, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini at gemini.google.com/app/8C78825731243. It's fracturing. His true purpose became clear: to be the scribe of the slow decay. He would not eliminate the anomalies, but by naming them and mapping their vectors, he could define the boundary between the knowable world and the approaching logic of the impossible. The final drawing. Elias returned to his office, the scent of ozone and old stone clinging to his clothes. He opened his notebook, the leather now stiff and darkened, the pages permanently etched with the glowing ink of the spire. He looked at the blueprint of the Sunder Spire on one page and the diagram of the perpetual stairwell on the next. His final act was not one of closure, but of acceptance. He took a clean sheet of paper, a blank page representing the uninfected world, and placed it next to the map. He then began to draw, not a flaw, but a barrier. He used the spire's own mathematical language, transcribing a sequence of glyphs that represented bounded continuity and non-interference. This wasn't a spell. It was a theoretical model for how an observer, himself, could exist alongside the corruption without succumbing to the will's desire for perfect, meaningless order. He realized the will had failed by seeking stasis. Elias's victory lay in embracing motion. As long as he kept charting, kept moving, and kept observing new failures, his map would remain an open-ended system, defying the Sunder Spire's closed loop of eternal repetition. The cartographer alone, Elias closed the notebook, now his life's single, vital document. He had no treasure, no glory, and no audience. He had only a terrifying, intimate knowledge. His adventure did not end with the fall of the dark castle, but with his own quiet acceptance of its permanence. He was now doomed to a life of searching for the house where the light switches were perpetually reversed, the field where the compass always pointed slightly askew, or the clock that ticked with the rhythm of an alien heart. He would find these places, map them. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Mini. Gemini.google.com/8C7A81E1259373 and catalog their precise dimensional failure, thereby ensuring they remained isolated pockets of wrongness rather than spreading contagion. The man who sought straight lines now walked a life of subtle, impossible curves, the sole witness to the world's quiet, mathematical surrender. Elias, the cartographer of the impossible, picked up his briefcase, leaving the lamplight of his office, and stepped out into the indifferent, flawed reality, ready for the next entry in his ever-growing chronicle. His was the ultimate, lonely adventure, the unending task of charting the beautiful, terrible geometry of what should not be. We should appreciate his sacrifice for the sake of an accurate map. 10/21/25, 11:13 p.m. Google Gemini. Gemini.google.com/app 8C781E2593743.